Stand-up comedy looks pretty simple, doesn't it? It's just one person, one microphone, and a bunch of jokes. But a comedy club? It's not just a room. It's a psychological pressure cooker. It's this incredibly fragile environment where the line between a killer show and absolute chaos is just razor thin. And sometimes that line breaks in the most unbelievable ways.
So when you see a headline like an armed man tackling Dave Chappelle on stage, it's totally shocking. But is it just a random one-off thing? Or is there something baked into the very DNA of stand-up comedy that makes these wild, unscripted, and sometimes truly tragic events almost inevitable? Well, that's what we're going to figure out.
You see, the chaos we witness in these clubs isn't just an accident. It's almost always the product of three very specific forces that come together to create this uniquely volatile environment. And once you understand these, you'll see why things can go so wrong so fast.
Okay, first up we have to talk about the performer's own psychology. It's this idea called the sad clown paradox. For a lot of comedians, humor isn't just a job. It's how they cope with anxiety or depression or trauma. So for them, the stage is both a sanctuary and a complete minefield. The laughter they get is like a drug. It's pure approval. But a heckle, that isn't just a joke that failed. No, it's a direct shot at their core defense mechanism.
All right, ingredient number 2 is the room itself. Here's the dirty little secret of comedy clubs. They're not really in the funny business, they're in the alcohol business. See, alcohol makes a crowd laugh easier and, more importantly, spend more money. But that exact same chemical that loosens people up is a total double-edged sword. It also makes them way more likely to interrupt and turn into that drunk person who thinks they're helping the show.
And finally, there's this invisible force that's supposed to hold the whole thing together, what we can call the unwritten contract. It's simple. The audience agrees to shut up and listen, and the comedian agrees to be funny. But a heckle? That's not just an interruption. It's a hostile takeover. It's a complete breach of that contract. It challenges the comedian's authority right when they're at their most vulnerable, and that can trigger a really explosive reaction.
And if you want to know what that breaking point looks like, this quote from Michael Richards, Kramer from Seinfeld, it says it all. After a heckler told him he wasn't funny, he said he was possessed by rage, that it came from insecurity, and that he felt at war. See, the heckle didn't just mess up his timing. It struck that deep vulnerability we talked about, and his coping mechanism completely flipped into pure destructive rage.
So when that contract shatters, what happens? Well, performers tend to react in one of 3 ways. They either dominate the chaos, they withdraw from it, or they completely collapse under the pressure.
Let's just quickly look at these 3 paths, right? First, you've got dominance. This is where the comic fights back and actually wins. Then there's withdrawal, which is more like a strategic retreat to stop a bigger fight. And finally, you have collapse. This is the most devastating one, where the comedian just breaks.
For a masterclass in pure dominance, you absolutely have to look at Bill Burr's legendary Philly rant. Back in 2006, he's facing this huge crowd that's just booing him off the stage, and he doesn't try to win them back with jokes. No, he goes to war. For 12 straight minutes, he just roasts them, insulting their city, their sports teams, everything. And the craziest part? The boos turned into cheers, and he walked off to a standing ovation. He took control by being meaner and stronger than their chaos.
Now, for withdrawal, let's look at Dave Chappelle in Hartford back in 2013. He's facing this super hostile, drunk crowd, and he makes a totally different choice. He said later that he wanted to pull a reverse Kramer, meaning he felt that same rage Michael Richards did, but instead of letting it explode, he withdrew. He just stopped telling jokes, sat on a stool, and ran out the clock on his set. It wasn't him failing, it was a really smart act of self-preservation.
And then there's collapse. This is what happens when the performer can't fight back and they can't withdraw. Michael Richards' career-ending racist outburst is, of course, the ultimate example. And in that very same year, Cat Williams' whole tour just became this series of public meltdowns, where he'd be challenging hecklers to fights and getting dragged off stage. In cases like these, the meltdown becomes the show.
But, sometimes the chaos isn't psychological at all. Sometimes it's the intrusion of something profoundly physical. Assaults, medical emergencies, even death that completely shatters the performance itself.
I mean, the Will Smith slap at the Oscars is easily the most famous modern example of this. It took that metaphorical war that Michael Richards talked about and made it terrifyingly real. An audience member broke that sacred boundary of the stage and physically assaulted the performer. It was just a catastrophic failure of every single social contract,
all at once. And medical emergencies? They show you the two absolute extremes of a crowd's behavior. On one hand, you have this incredible story from a Drew Lynch show, where total strangers, nurses and an EMT in the audience, all came together to save a man's life. But on the other side, there's this tragedy in Melbourne, where a man died in the back of the theater while the people up front, who had no idea, just kept laughing. It's just a chilling example of two completely different realities existing in the same room.
But maybe the most surreal form of chaos is when the performer themselves dies right there on stage. And what is so chilling is the pattern. Tommy Cooper, Dick Shawn, Ian Cognito. In every single one of these cases, when they collapsed, the audience laughed. They thought it was part of the act. Ian Cognito had literally just joked about dying from a stroke, so when he had a fatal heart attack moments later, the audience just kept laughing for 5 whole minutes. The line between performance and reality had completely disappeared.
So all this brings us to a really modern problem. In our age of viral stunts and clout chasing, what happens when the chaos isn't even real? And more importantly, how are we supposed to tell the difference?
The original master of this, of course, was Andy Kaufman. He was the king of staged chaos. The guy would bring a sleeping bag on stage and take a nap, or he'd read The Great Gatsby out loud until every single person left. For Kaufman, the chaos was the art. It was a deliberate performance designed to mess with the audience and make them question what a show even is.
Now contrast Kaufman's art with this incident from 2024. A video went viral of Mark Norman's show being dramatically evacuated. I mean, it looked terrifyingly real, but a few days later it was revealed to be a corporate marketing stunt for a TV show. And the reaction wasn't awe, it was just disappointment. Kaufman's chaos was art. This was just an ad. And it completely shattered the audience's trust.
And that gets us to the most crucial point here. The chaos of the room is essential to stand-up comedy only when it's real. That genuine, unscripted risk, the possibility of a Bill Burr rant, a Michael Richards collapse, or even a life-saving miracle in the crowd, that's what makes live comedy so high stakes, so thrilling, and so uniquely human. And that leaves us with one last question. In a world of perfectly curated, predictable content, is it that very risk of disaster that keeps stand-up so powerfully and so thrillingly alive?